Hi, everybody. In the spirit of distributed collaboration, this is going to be an interesting panel for us to kind of manage and stage manage. Obviously, we'll be sort of joined virtually by Malia in probably about 20 minutes or so to kind of respond in some ways to the discussion that we're going to have here on stage with our 2025 AMaGA residency fellows. Maybe briefly, to quickly kind of set the scene and set the stage, if we can just pass down the line, a couple introductions.
Oh, okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan. Like many of us here, I started my early career as a sort of creative technologist. I was a photographer, moved into photo media and experimented with emerging technology. In my sort of mid-career, I was an academic. I worked a long time at UTS teaching media arts production, and then moved to the ABC where I was working on an ARC research grant with a group called iCinema. And about 10 years ago, I landed my dream job at the Australian Museum, where I've been leading digital design of our online products over the last 10 years, which includes our incredible website. It gets like 11 million visitors a year, including a lot of bots now, so that's a very increasing challenge. We do a lot of digital content production, really focusing on video into the future. We did a wellness podcast. There's really exciting projects all the time. I'm also involved in the Sydney Culture Network. I chair their council and run a data salon for cultural workers in the sector to sort of share our experiences. So it is that real collaboration. And it was a real honour to be sort of recognised as the established professional in this residency. And I sort of teamed up with a group called Museum Data Services in the University of Leicester. So I'm really excited to sort of share the insights and my experience in that residency. Over to you, Jan.
So I'm Janice Falsone, and I'm the Gallery Director at the South East Centre for Contemporary Art, SECA, which is a newly reimagined regional gallery on Duranganj country in the Yuin Nation, in the far south coast of New South Wales. We're the cultural heart of that southeast part of the world. Our closest peer gallery is 3 hours away. And I was chosen as the mid-career recipient of the AMaGA International residency and attended the Belvedere Summer School Digital Collections, Collecting Institutions in the Digital World with these amazing people, and then headed over to Canada and was hosted by Galleries Ontario and Surface Impression. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that soon.
Thanks, Jan. My name is Edwina Green. I'm a very proud Trowaway woman from Northeast Lutruwita. I'm a artist and curator, and I studied at the VCA, and like many artists, to sustain our careers as an artist, we become arts workers. So I've done various kind of roles. I worked at Rising as an associate producer, and then most recently was the curator of First Nations art at the National Gallery of Victoria. I'm the early career artist, so the baby of the group, but definitely was taken under the wings of these beautiful women, and was at the Belvedere Summer School with both of them, and then University of Leicester, and spent some time at the British Museum in London.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm not sure if we have Malia able to kind of come onto the screen to say hello. Yes, we do. Hello, Malia.
Hi. Nice to see everyone. Big fan of Australia. I have not been to Melbourne yet, but love Sydney. Anyway, I think there was a long introduction about me and philanthropy 14 times. But anyway, happy to be here and to participate.
Thank you. And again, Malia will kind of come back in to join us probably in about 20 minutes after we sort of introduce and cover the residency program. So Before we swap the slide again, for anybody who would like to sort of ask some questions, obviously please use the Slido. Again, we do have quite a lot of content and experience and lived experience to cover in the session, let alone the technical moving back and forth across the globe. So we'll hopefully have some time at the end to respond to a couple of the audience questions. If not, we'll do our best offline or post-presentation to take some of those comments on board and respond accordingly. So if we can switch over to the slide presentation. Thank you. So, yep, and I've got the clicker, so away we go. There we are. Again, acknowledging Edwina's sort of intimate connection to country, we'd also just collectively like to sort of recognize this particular acknowledgement again to Australian, continuing Indigenous connection to country. Before we sort of get to a granular level with the actual residencies that these guys experienced, it's going to be my sort of job to kind of quickly do a helicopter view of the program, where it comes from, and in an effort to connect some of the dots. So we'll try to contextualize the AMaGA International Residencies program and some of the partners and the extensive range of partners that we sort of drew upon, which again will illustrate this sort of distributed collaboration approach. The International Residencies Program functions within the broader sectoral role of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, or AMaGA, which as the national association and peak advocacy body representing museums and galleries in the country, seeks to champion and connect a diverse, inclusive, and thriving museum and gallery sector, and in that process, inspire innovation in the face of sectoral change and challenge, which Sophia so aptly and ably sketched out for us earlier this morning. In a direct way, these residencies support AMaGA in delivering on its strategic priorities, and that includes digital transformation as one of those core pillars. The initiative itself sits alongside another important research-led initiative that I've had the privilege and pleasure to be essentially part of, and that is the program called Assembly. Assembly has become a basis for rethinking the nature, purpose, and value of university, museums, and galleries collaboration through research. Over the past couple of years, Assembly has served as a cross-sector forum, acknowledging my colleagues who I was involved in co-developing the program with, Sejul Malda from the ANU, and also Katie Russell, who's here, over here. Hi, Katie, in her role as AMaGA's National Director and CEO. As an R&D initiative, Assembly strives to support Australian museums and their stakeholders better understand, value, enable, and practice purposeful, collaborative research in changing contexts. And from our engagement to date, we strongly believe that there are untapped opportunities for us collectively to explore alternative forms of museum collaborative research. So in this respect, it's also important for me personally to acknowledge the important contribution that the Institute for Digital Culture has played in underwriting some of these aspirations. The Institute, under the directorship of Ross Parry, who some of you may remember joined us here at FACT a couple of years ago, is committed to supporting and working with the creative and cultural sectors internationally in their adaptation to digital change in ways that are value-driven, needs-based, and people-centered. This approach is represented through the capacity-building commitments that the Institute continues to demonstrate, which build in part on the success of the One by One research program, which was embarked upon almost a decade ago now. One by One was a multi-partner international initiative that brought together cultural organizations, policymakers, academics, professional bodies, support agencies, and communities of practice to build the digital literacy of UK museums. The offshoots of that project have recently been contextualized more broadly in a recently published book called Museums and Digital Confidence. That's part of the Routledge book series that I co-edit along with Ross. More directly still, AMaGA's Mobile International Residencies program harnessed the inbuilt network building capacity of the Institute and the global network of research observatories that we've established with key partners in the UK, Europe, and North America. First and foremost amongst those being in this collaboration project, the Belvedere Research Center. A chief outlet of this partnership with the Belvedere has been their annual summer school, which is hosted in Vienna in September on an annual basis. It evolves from its inception as the Getty Summer Institute, which was established back in 2023, and the Belvedere Summer School offers Austrian, German, and Swiss art workers the opportunity to undertake a week-long intensive program where participants can develop their digital skills and wherewithal to effectively use, maintain, and grow the digital resources, operations, and strategies of their respective cultural organizations. And that program has been supported, thankfully, through Austrian ministry buy-in and continuing support. And that sort of Austrian thing is something that we did obviously play off of this past year by, in a way, finding the means and mechanisms by which to have our 3 Australian fellows join that particular cohort. So how was this network capacity harnessed? Very quickly, I'll just step through the points. Creative Australia's Arts Project for Organizations was identified, and with the valuable contribution made by Chloe Powell in her then role as AMaGA's Strategic Research Projects lead, we managed to successfully secure the necessary funding to make this all happen. The format of the residencies was designed to support up to 3 weeks, with the first week being a week in common in Vienna, based at the summer school, before everybody went on their separate ways. To name check the partners that were involved in Austria very quickly, Christian Humer, the director, and his incredible team at the Belvedere Research Center, a host of colleagues that we collaborated with from the University of Continuing Education in Krems, Franz Smola, the curator of Belvedere's Gustav Klimt Pigment to Pixel exhibition, the Ars Electronica Festival, Gerfried Stocker, artistic director, Anna Weiss from Future Lab, and also Manuela Navo, who's the curator of last year's exhibition called Panic. And lastly, and not least, our colleagues from Museum Booster in Vienna. We had the pleasure of actually being hosted there by Arturo and Monica during our visit. Deep breath. Home stretch before we hand over. The main residency partners, as everybody already kind of introduced, the Institute for Digital Culture and the Museum Data Service in the UK, where both Megan and Edwina sort of engaged with, and Galleries Ontario, or GOG, and Surface Impression from our Canadian partners in Toronto, who Janice collaborated with. Finally, before I hand over to Edwina to kind of lead us through a few more things, and her experience in particular, some brief notes on the structure of the call-out and the key considerations in our selection process. We were really conscious in putting the program together to embrace the dimensionality of the actual field. So we had a commitment to early, mid, and senior established career practitioners, capital city and regional centers being part of our criteria, looking at large, middle, small cultural organizations, and also importantly, First Nations representation as part of that mix. I might finish my sort of bit by briefly just saying a few things on behalf of Katie before handing over. So the International Residencies program that Megan, Jan, and Edwina will now speak about was designed to provide an opportunity for 3 Australian sector professionals to explore how digital technologies were being deployed and the digital mindsets embraced in the Northern Hemisphere, and perhaps even more importantly, to be ambassadors for the great work that is actually being done here in Australia. Kudos to Megan, Jan, and Edwina, who, given the short timing between the awarding of the grant and getting residencies underway, managed this hurdle so capably, with grace and good spirit, and this is something that we will do our best to avoid in future iterations of the project. Finally, it's important to note that despite the short turnaround time for applications, the response rate was incredibly high, with just under 100 impressive applications received from people all across the museum, gallery, and cultural collections ecosystem. That really kind of sort of said to us how there is obviously a demand, but there is also such a reservoir of talent that this program will hopefully continue to nurture into the future. Some of you may know that Creative Australia's apt name for this is called Unfunded Excellence, and we hope that you will agree when you hear from Megan, Jan, and Edwina that this program is ripe for expansion to contribute to ongoing international exchange and networking of peers seeking to work collaboratively through complexities that are facing the work of cultural organizations. And with that, I will hand over and pass the baton across to Edwina. So please, take it away.
I'll grab that. Thank you, Vince. So one of the first things that I noticed when I got to Vienna is that cultural appropriation is an international phenomenon, and I get greeted with it everywhere that I go, which is absolutely incredible. But I guess I'd love to yarn about kind of why I was really interested in the program and what really drew me to this residency. And at the time that I had applied for the residency, I was working as a curator of First Nations art at the NGV. And one of the biggest roadblocks or things that I noticed that we were missing within kind of the institutional context was record keeping of First Nations art and community and knowledge systems. And my proposal for the residency was really about exploring how First Nations sovereignty can be embedded within data strategies and the ways in which we record keep, and that this is ever evolving and ever changing, and really subject to every single mob and clan and families within those clans as well. So that was kind of the interest in that, and then also the opportunity to go to the UK and see some family collections as well. Go next. So this is kind of my, I think this was day 2 of the residency, and I found out a week or 2 before I got on the plane to come that I was pregnant. So this was a very stark reminder of what was to come. So when they were asking us to put together these slides, I was like, what are the moments that really stuck out to me? So I'm glad that this was here. But something that I also noticed in Vienna was that public art is a million times more provocative than what we really see in Australia, and that was really refreshing and challenging, and yeah. We'll yarn, throughout the whole session, but a big part of what I'm trying to do as a curator and artist is steal all of our objects back. So it was very, it was almost a tease being there in this collection space, seeing all of these ancestral items. But something that really I don't think would not have been possible without this residency is to be able to see these items in the British Museum. They have the largest collection of my family items, including shell necklaces, bull kelp carriers, woven baskets, and it was a really profound experience being in these spaces, but also to be able to see the other First Nations collection that they have, and also the lack of knowledge that they have within these collections was really challenging, and being able to say to the person that was taking me through, that's been misidentified as something. So understanding that the records and kind of collections online that we have access to now are not necessarily accurate and represent First Nations knowledge systems as well. This was so Megan and I spent one of our days going to, what was that castle called?
Warwick Castle.
Warwick Castle, which was the most colonizer thing that I've ever done in my life. It was amazing. It was so fun. But on our way out, we went to this like kitschy secondhand store, and we found this Zulu shield that is estimated to be between 1899 and 1902, which is a piece of significance for my family. My husband's South African with Zulu heritage, and just thinking about the complexity of the UK and Britain, and that you can find these, ancestral objects at a kitsch store, and I got it for like £40. Like and I brought it home. So there's like little pieces of repatriation happening, but understanding the depth of how much Britain has in terms of like historical and cultural items that are just kind of floating around in people's attics. I might pass to you.
Hey, that's me. Cool. Thanks. So in my role at SECA, I was focused on how regional galleries can connect with audience, expand access, and amplify artist and community voices. So that's the lens that I had going into the residency. But it builds on my experience of working in the not-for-profit visual arts, small to medium sector for the last 15 years. I've been in the role at SECA, the South East Centre for Contemporary Art, for a year now, but when I applied for the residency, it was, like 8 months or something. But before that, immediately before that, I was the director at Canberra Contemporary. And while I was at Canberra Contemporary, we participated in the Creative Australia Digital Strategist in Residence program. And that was incredible because we were partnered with MIAM, and I don't know if Elise and Sam are in the audience today. Hey! And they were just like being part of that program and just seeing how they were engaging with, doing roundtables with artists in our community, board, this kind of like whole zoom out on what is possible and how digital strategy then has this kind of ripple effect through the whole organisation, was a really great foundation for me leading into this residency, and it led to really cool things like the whole rebranding project. And immediately after that, I was part of a community of practice. There was a research project with Deakin University and Creative Australia called Audience Diversification in the Arts. And Canberra Contemporary, we were the smallest contributors by far to that in terms of size. And there were some heavy hitters as part of that community of practice and, cross art forms. And I learnt so much from that and talking to peers and colleagues across different scales of organisations and how you can make things scalable, and just having our hand held by incredible change makers through that process. So that's a bit of context about what I was able to bring into the residency and through and build on. So with the residency, I was looking for practical examples to measure impact, data-driven decision-making, digital storytelling, audience engagement initiatives, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty best practice examples, and how galleries are preparing for the AI revolution. Well, it's here, but how do we future-proof, and what are those kind of conversations on an international level? So, but particularly models are adaptable to the small to medium sector and the regional gallery sector, where, because of geography, mobility, access, I feel like digital is really important part of the conversation and isn't just a, value add-on. It's actually kind of essential to the work that we're doing. First up, we went to Vienna and participated in the Belvedere Summer School. So this is the summer school participants and presenters and us, and it was just a really incredible, intensive week-long learning. But the residency as a whole, there was 12 I conducted like 12 one-on-one interview kind of meetings, attended 13 presentations from sector leaders, and made 48 new professional connections across 35 cultural institutions from 7 different countries. So it was, a whirlwind of connection and sharing and learning. Some of the key takeaways were digital transformation is about leadership and relevance, not necessarily trends. Digital strategy must align with organisation value, vision and purpose, and be scalable. Prioritise sustainable long-term digital solutions, so seeing, as digital assets. That was a light bulb moment for me. And also, regardless of size, different organisations are at different levels of digital maturity. So I think post-digital is going to be talked about later, but some organisations are still at the starting kind of block. And also, ethical approaches to digital rights, artist copyright, and responsible AI. Those were things that I was really looking forward to kind of delving into more with the international colleagues. One of the really cool things at one of the presentations by the Belvedere Research Centre was a project that they'd worked on called the Museum Gaze, where they were like doing eye tracking to kind of get a sense of, what people look at when they look at art, how long they'll spend with art, how long they will read a didactic piece. So there were so many examples. I mean, that's just a very, very small one that I've been thinking about still, but there were so many examples of really cool case studies and different things that is happening around the world that I got access to that I wouldn't have otherwise. And contemporary galleries are often taking an artist-led approach, using technology as a creative medium rather than solely like an interpretive tool. And I guess that's, coming from a contemporary art gallery lens, that's where I was particularly drawn to and interested in. And so going to the Ars Electronica Festival was fantastic for that, and their incredible, Panic exhibition. And there was just, there's so many great pieces there, but just one very, very quick one that I want to tell you about was Whispers by Kaylin Segal. So it was an installation mimicking a live debate featuring AI actors. So like hyper exaggerated ideological archetypes inspired by real world social media personalities, and you got to give them provocations. So like type in something and then they'd all have this debate. And I typed in freedom of expression. And it was really confronting, what was being coming back at us, and just reminded me of, how artists are using technology in really interesting ways to help reflect the world that we're living in. And this is Megan and me at the Ars Electronica Centre having a really fun engagement with a motion sensor work. Okay. And then, I went to Canada, where I was partnered with, hosted by Galleries Ontario. So they are like AMaGA, but for the Ontario. So it's a membership organisation that services, different galleries around there. And I was really interested in the fact that they have lots of regional galleries and, how that relates to the work that I'm doing. And they have a great relationship with a company called Surface Impression, which are digital leader specialists, and they collaborate. And Surface Impression and GOG have rolled out these great capacity building projects for the sector. The first one was called data shy to data driven, and that was like a year-long project. You sign up and they kind of nurture these organisations through these kind of different stages to build their confidence, and that's then evolved into the digital data service. I think that's what it's called. Yep. And which a bit more tailored, so they actually talk to the organisations about what they need, and then they work with them to develop those solutions and actually take some of the more time-intensive work out for them, because they particularly, I think we're all resource-strapped, but in the small to medium sector, you're so lean that to add anything else, it's not able to happen unless you have that extra support. And so I got to just quickly, a couple of examples of that was at the Aga Khan Museum and the Ottawa Art Gallery. They went through the data Shida data-driven project, and how they are doing, collecting audience data and using that and other data to do that actually data-driven decision making, and how that had a ripple effects through all their organisation, and when they actually start programming or marketing, or how they tailor things. That was really exciting. The Art Gallery of Northumberland are part of the next iteration of the project, and they are actually working with Surface Impression to develop an algorithm to better understand the artists in their area. So they're a regional gallery like Secca, and they kind of feel like there's a lot more people in the area that they're not reaching, and particularly artists, and how can they better connect with them. Okay, over to Megan.
Thank you. Gosh, I absolutely echo. We're not really talking a lot about the summer school experience, unfortunately, but it was such an incredible experience. And I also wanted to say thanks to Seb for inviting us, because it's like we got the band back together. Yes. We had such an incredible connection, and shout out to Vince and Ross for selecting us. I think he did a really good job. Because we instantly really bonded.
We'll take the credit.
Yeah, that's right. So we were very thankful for that. But yeah, look, my application really focused on a long-standing problem to solve for me, which is how might we build a usable interface to our massive collection of 22 million natural science specimens, an incredibly huge archive, a photographic collection, and a really significant cultural collection, which are currently sitting in quite siloed data sets. Our natural science specimens, which across all the ichthyology, entomology, paleontology, some of them are accessible through the Atlas of Living Australia, but our own online collection project has been always in the back of my mind. Sometimes I get funding and it gets taken away. It's a real problem to solve, because it's currently kind of locked away in a collection management system, and even the vendors' sort of solutions aren't usable. So when I saw this residency and to be afforded a 3-week period to really do a deep dive with the museum data services that have been addressing exactly the same problems on even bigger scale, I absolutely jumped at it, and I was so thankful to get that opportunity. So my executive was really supportive, my family was really supportive, which was amazing, and thank you to AMaGA for setting this up. It was a real joy. So I won't go into the summer school. I did do a data salon, and I'm going to share the slides from that deck. It went for 90 minutes. As a visual artist, I documented the whole experience and created a visual story. So there's a lot of insights that are going into it. So I'm going to just kind of touch on some of the main findings that I found, and really happy to take questions afterwards, or connect people with other people. But I'd heard about the Museum Data Services project. It was seeded by a bit of UK government funding, and then by Bloomberg Philanthropy actually put in £1 million. And it's to create an index of all the museum collections in the UK. So it's kind of this really ambitious project to work with collections, no matter the size of them as well, big to small, and particularly focusing on that mid-size as well. And what they've done, and so I got to actually sit down with their data management service team and really understand the solution that they were implementing, because I have that same problem. How do I pull together quite different collections into a usable interface? And it has a scalable solution as well. And it's kind of simple, and I was kind of shocked by that too. I'm like, there's no pictures, and that was really hard for me to cope with, and I understood why later. It's because it's basically creating a copy through a middleware solution, and it's called a CIM, CIIM, if you want to look it up. Through a group called Knowledge Integration have developed this middleware solution. And so they're working, through reaching out and collaborating and connecting with all the different museums, pulling their data sets from their collection management systems and kind of replicating them into this index of everything in the UK. And so it's a really nice option for those mid-sized ones. They're getting a backup as well, which is a really good idea. And it also means that you don't have to clean your own data to get it into that system. It kind of all happens at that level. Anyway, that's a really simple, explanation. There's a lot of papers and presentations around what they're doing. And so I also took advantage of the residency to connect with all my own counterparts in the UK, not all of them, but particularly the natural history museums. And you can see here I got a lot of behind-the-scenes tours of their digitisation projects. I met with their digital teams. We had a bit of shoulder crying happening as they had just done a huge migration project in London, which went live, and even their website went down this week, so I was almost going to reach out to them. They were showing me prototypes of some of the internal digitisation work that they're doing. The 2 photographs I've included are because we deal with insects, so the insect collections are the biggest ones. And so their digitisation is literally to unpick, all the labels, take a photographs and then relabel it and, move on to the next. They're not doing any data entry, it's literally just photography. And so that prototype is a way to not have to unpin them and save some time so they can get 500 insects in a day. The Natural History Museum just got awarded £155 million for the next 10 years to do natural science digitisation. And most of it is 70% is going to people power to do this kind of work. So it shows you the scale of the investment needed just to get the pictures, and of course we all know AI will solve everything down the line. So while I was over there, the big takeaway I took from the summer school was this, post-digital mindset. I don't know if you've all been hearing about it or talking about it here. It was new to me in that it's signifying maturity in our sector and that a lot of the foundational problems have been solved. And we all kind of looked at each other and they're like, really? But it's true. Like if you do the research and the documentation, it is kind of resolved, how to build a website, how, collection management systems, all these, metadata standards. So it was a really fantastic way to think, oh, okay, well, we're moving to post-digital and, those foundational issues are resolved. And so with that mindset on, wherever I was going around in museums, I was looking for really good examples of how digital is really embedded in exhibition displays and in the work that we all are doing. And so here's just a few examples that I thought would kind of stand out. The top one is the redisplay of the Natural History Museum in Oxford. In some of their areas, the Pitts Rivers Museum, they'd have a screen kind of shoved in the corner with some kind of digital element in it. That's the digital era. The post-digital era is where it's embedded in the actual display. So it was kind of considered from the outset, and that's sort of showing the mechanics of how limbs move and things like that. So they had done a really great post-digital display kind of era example. The one below, I spent a lot of time in Leicester with Edwina. I went to the Jury Wall Museum, which, I think they must have been Ross Parry's students because it was, so post-digital, in that digital was embedded everywhere in the storytelling, along with the objects on display. So, you start to get that sense of, well, what is post-digital? It's, signifying maturity and embodied kind of within the displays as well. And that final example is probably the best augmented reality experience I've ever done on a sort of site, in that, it's an archaeological site. You get to the end, there's this very beautifully designed QR code. You scan that, and then it would bring to life the site that you're on. It was a Roman baths, and you could actually see it and explore the same site you are. And it was just a really lovely example of augmented reality that we don't always see. Finally, Bruegel off to the side. I got obsessed with people taking photos of the artworks right in front of their faces. I have an exhibition to put together. I've got some really great examples of them. But this one here was like, below it, there's another QR code, not so beautifully designed, but it would launch the digitised image of that painting. And it wasn't just the high resolution, they went through different kind of spectrograms of it too. So I thought that was a really lovely offer of thinking of, we as museum collections, we do these digitisations, how are we linking back to, those new artefacts and new ways of seeing. Digital inclusion and accessibility was a huge, it's a passion of mine. and of Ross in particular. He really talked about multi-sensory ways of documenting collections from the outset, and I thought that was really positive and strong, that often we're just, accessioning objects, but instead we should be capturing, sensory descriptions of the material at the time, sort of for, like, we do a lot of audio guides down the line, but, I was thinking in collection, and to your point, Edwina, of how it's actually been captured, cultural sensitivity and warnings was another big part of it. I know I'm going too long, but I met some really great researchers, PhD students. I had lots of long conversations. I wish I had your analytics of this is how many conversations I had. But what I did do, I took a Claude AI recorder. I don't know if you guys have got, not Claude, but Claude. And I recorded and documented everything. So I have many, many, hours of recordings and really amazing summaries. And that just meant I could be engaged in the conversations, which was fantastic. Shelby was looking at audience research with autistic adults and taking them to immersive experiences, and really shared with me the value of visual stories. And if your museum doesn't have a visual story, you really need to invest in that. There's such a great offer for everybody. And she was actually developing video visual stories as well, and I got some really good insights around that. Another thing I observed over in the UK were lots of tactile maps. I don't know how much we do that here. I feel like we don't do it. At the beginning of every museum, there's a beautiful, huge tactile map, and you could really work out what you're going to do, and it's helpful for all of us. And there were also 2 examples there in Vienna, again, of that idea of when we're doing digitisation and taking it onto the floor, touch tables. There's a fantastic 3D scan of one of these sculptures that's there behind glass, and then next to it was the 3D printed model of it, and you could actually touch it, which was great. As well as the Vienna visitor guide. They had, the story of the Habsburg Empire, which is fascinating. And then down low, you could actually feel the crown and hear the audio description. So those access needs were really baked into it. This is my last slide. Immersive experiences is my favourite thing in the world. So I did them wherever I went. And, I spent a week in London, based at the Natural History Museum. I spent a day at the National Gallery with Lawrence Charles and John Stack, who I'd sort of connected with beforehand. They were incredibly generous with their time, talking about our digital teams. They've got a digital team of 25. They've built a studio. And they have this magnificent 12-metre, 16K screen on entry, and it had just gone live. So we were talking about their programming for these screens. And the National Gallery had just done its 200-year anniversary, and we've got ours coming up. So there were lots of really good learnings around how they programmed and what the digital team was doing to support that kind of significant anniversary. And also Dave Patton. I'd met Dave many times at conferences. I kind of knew of his work. But then I got to spend a whole day with Dave, and he took me through the Science Museum, and he showed me everything, from start to finish, of all the work that he'd done over his career. It was a masterclass. It was amazing. It just, supercharged my own expertise in that field. So I was really thankful for the opportunity. Lots of AR. People asked me what my favourite thing was, and I got to go to ABBA Voyage, which was amazing. It's all holograms of ABBA, screens, lasers, and a whole band. I think it's the future. That's it from me.
Thank you. Hopefully that's given everybody kind of like a good sense of kind of the extent of the different residencies and the range of engagements, that they sort of offered. And I would like to come back maybe at the end to kind of thinking about residencies and I guess a little bit more about the idea of reciprocity that's kind of involved in residencies. But I guess we wanted to kind of maybe sort of finish our section off by just talking a little bit more from everybody's perspective about what you have done with that experience since you've actually been back. And again, we've noticed a few kind of comments with the Slido coming through about, yes, we're looking at some examples here that might be very rarefied and kind of done by institutions at a sort of a high level. Everybody here is working in a different dimension, of the sector, and also kind of engaging within that work at all sorts of different sort of professional scales as well. So I think kind of getting a sense of kind of what your individual kind of takeaway, and we did ask you to kind of think about sort of one example that you might like to share. Hopefully that will kind of start to represent a little bit more about how, that sort of exposure can actually kind of take root in some way in the work that you're actually doing here in your particular situation. So maybe if we start with Ed.
Thank you so much for sharing. It was so beautiful and very insightful. So really what I'm up to now is growing a baby, so I will be out of commission for a little bit. But as this residency was happening, I was in the design process of a major public art commission that is about to be moved to the Maribyrnong River. And I guess maintaining an arts practice as an artist, but also having kind of the institutional context has been really helpful in the way that I document, but also the way that I describe my works, and ensuring that access to understanding my practice and, the intention behind certain works is ever present. So one of the big things that we did when we were creating the labeling for these works was making sure that kids could really understand it. And that was a really important thing for me in terms of access and inclusion, and making sure that the way that we speak as arts professionals is not so cerebral that, everyday humans are not understanding what we're trying to say. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm working on and doing this year.
Wonderful. You're busy.
Yeah.
So for me, the residency came at a really pivotal moment in SECA's evolution. It's only been open for a couple of years, but builds on 35 years of cultural contribution to the region. And we're in the process of developing our first strategic plan for SECA, and so all of this thinking is directly feeding into that. We also just, as of like 2 weeks ago, have a new role, a gallery collection officer, which is so great because we can actually, some of the learnings from the Belvedere Summer School and best practice kind of collection management can all be kind of fed into a lot of work that needs to happen there. That's really exciting. And we've also been just like teeing up collaborations. One is there's a not-for-profit organisation that has recently established in the Bega Valley called the Bega Valley Data Collective. And they're like social and market researchers and just people who are really interested in collecting wellbeing data for the region, not just like data that's kind of aggregated or kind of from other, like how do we actually capture it ourselves? And so we've been able to pick up a really juicy conversation and start collaborating, and we've fed into their survey, which is just now launched, to make sure there's things like arts and culture is part of the things that people are asked to respond to if it does contribute to their wellbeing in the area. So it'll be really interesting to see the outcomes of that survey and how we can use that data to help inform our programming. What are the priority needs for the community that we're working for? But they also, in turn, helped us with our new visitor survey, which we never had before. And that's what this image is of. And talking to particularly the peers over in Canada, the ones that went through the Data Shard, a data-driven project, and their visitor surveys and visitor engagement, we've been able to kind of take a lot of different examples and, make something that is locally relevant but, globally informed, which is exciting. And yeah, there's the initiative called the Circular Economy, Bega Circular Economy Agenda. So that kind of links into this idea of, working locally but connecting to these global ideas. So that links into that. And we've established a cultural collective where we're looking to better communicate how we're measuring impact and work together for joint advocacy. We are the, one and only visual arts organisation in the region, but there are other art form organisations. And so, yeah, just working more closely together for that. Plus the other thing is I'm on the board of NAVA, and so I guess, you know, this residency has helped, well, I just bring a different lens to my work there. And this, you know, artist rights and, you know, AI and all the things, and particularly like last year with the productivity commission, you know, the proposal for the copyright changes so that artists and creators weren't actually paid or acknowledged for their work. I'm really glad that didn't go through. But it's just all of that. There's a big advocacy space that I'm really interested in, and I feel better equipped from the residency.
Thank you.
So many things. Maybe one. I think, you know, I'm still working on this vision of, you know, what a usable online collection search is, and what I love is that I found a solution that is kind of scalable, so even people like Jan's organisations, we could start with New South Wales, go to Australia. Wouldn't that be wonderful? One place that you could search all the collections, particularly for people like Edwina, to see what is hidden within those archives. So I think that that's what I'm always kind of working on, and you know, it's a big funded project, and I know there's some really important people in this room that could actually really help make that real. And, you know, because it needs to be sustainable for all of us, you know, and so I can then make a really pretty interface, which would be fantastic, to all those, you know, that really dense data sets that are in there. So the other thing that, you know, I was always looking at is, you know, seeing the real thing is really important as well, you know, so not just being, not, you know, to have that opportunity to do more than attend a conference or desk work and actually get there and be in the sector and meet the people, those connections that we're all talking about, you know, that Museum Booster were talking about as well. It's just so valuable, and we need to support it for our staff, you know. And one thing I took away from Ross as well was how important it is for, you know, content warnings, not for our users, but also for our staff as well, you know, in these collections, to Edwina's point as well. Yeah, so that's the main thing. That's one of my favourite pictures.
Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes in our time slot, and we'd like to sort of bring Malia onto the stage with us, and in a way hopefully use you know, Malia's presence to kind of also kind of follow through on some of the points that have been raised. I think it's really just kind of been so one of the key sort of threads through all of this, and which I'm sure Malia will take up on, is really this kind of need for investment in people power, right? People as part of this kind of technological space that we're kind of working in today. So it'd be great to hear from Malia in terms of her kind of experience, you know, from the Bloomberg philanthropy side of things. And again, please strike up any notes, Malia, that you kind of feel, you know, kind of resonate or connect with kind of the experiences that were just shared. So over to you.
Great, thank you. First of all, this program sounds amazing, and we probably should look into supporting it. What a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you.
And everybody's experience is so impressive. So it's just amazing to have the opportunity to listen to all of you talk about your work, the organizations you're representing, and what you've learned by going to other places and meeting other people, which I think is key for a lot of the work that we do. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but these kinds of events and conferences and conversations are the things that what keep things moving forward, especially in a time where there's so much happening. I'm here in San Francisco, which is, I think, the kind of global center of AI, and every day there's something new here. It's like an amazing story how AI is going to help everyone, and then the doom loop of how it's going to be terrible for everyone. So, which is why I feel fortunate that I can focus on the arts, because I feel like the arts are always the things that uplift people, whether you're an artist or viewing art. It's always important to have that in your life. So I feel fortunate that we're able to support that. through our philanthropy. I wanted to just share a couple things about kind of the funding cycle that we've had in the US in terms of digital. So in 2010, we were funding kind of two types of digital projects, sort of bespoke art projects that were trying to be immersive interactions with audiences, and then audio guides. Because we were trying to support creative projects, but also digital efforts that are allowing people to know the story, maybe behind the artwork or the story behind the organization. And then 2 years later, everybody was creating apps or bespoke digital projects that were focused on audience engagement and getting people to engage with things, but in a digital way, which now that we think about it, it's a little bit nuts that we wanted people to focus on their phone when they were in the museum. And then we started to hear more about podcasts and audio and radio shows. And so we decided, okay, let's go back and fund that because people just want to be talked to while they're going through museums. And then the pandemic happened and no one could go anywhere. And so lots of our grantees and organizations were saying, how can you help us kind of get our information online because people have to stay at home? And that's where we decided to start thinking about what are the kind of unsexy digital projects and programs that we can support. Because everybody wants to fund the fun, interactive, engaging, immersive pieces, but we like to look for where the unmet needs are. And so this was an area where we thought we could really be helpful and step in. And so we started to think through a program that we support in both the US and the UK now. It's called the Digital Accelerator Program. And it's where we support organizations for 2 years. We provide them funding for all kinds of digital projects, whether it's, digitizing your archives, improving your website, your content management system. What are all the back-end things you need to be able to be sharing your collection or performances or, whatever art it is with folks online who might be interested in what you're doing, but might not be able to visit you in person. And so the last thing I'll say about that is that even over these last 15 years, there are still 3 key areas that we see that are still big needs. And I was curious to hear from the panel folks if that is the case for you as well. So it's still, the resources that are still needed are people. So we don't have enough people to kind of help with this work. The time that it takes to figure out, how you're going to manage this project. What are the things you're going to digitize? Where do you sift through this data? And then expertise. So, people know a little bit about this. Maybe someone's an expert in this, but there isn't someone who can kind of oversee the whole project. And so that's where, with our grant program, we're trying to provide funding. So hopefully that can help either hire people or bolster people who already work there, maybe increase their salary, and then enable them to have time to work on these projects. And then we also provide a consultant who can help keep these projects on track and maybe pick up the slack for the areas that you don't, or that you need help in.
That's great, thank you. I think that last point about kind of what is expertise and what do things like residencies, which again, looking at a few of the comments on Slido, queries around sort of the investment that needs to be made into that and kind of what the sort of return on investment, I guess, is. Thinking about kind of what expertise looks like or what expertise, how you build expertise. I'm wondering kind of, again, from maybe our panel's experience, how did that translate? How did you move between, let's say, the idea of skills at one end of that equation, the idea that you would go to, let's say, a summer school and learn particular skills in AI, as an example, versus the other end of the scale being acquiring a better literacy around the way that, let's say, that technology might impact directly, but also in less direct ways on your own individual sort of skill set, let's say. Just wondering how you kind of work through that idea of the role that the residency played in building your expertise. Any thoughts?
I'm always digital's never done. it's a journey, and I think my career and there's lots of people here who would feel the same. You need that creative intelligence to be constantly experimenting and playing with new things, and so upskilling is a summer school shows you a lot of stuff and it's very intense. But I don't think you get skills from it. You just become more aware of where you need to skill up potentially. That's how I would answer that.
I'd echo that.
Yeah.
She captured it.
Yeah.
Did it. Well done. In terms of sort of your provocation or your prompt there, Malia, in terms of what you heard from these guys, in terms of sort of what they shared back as sort of, let's say, lived experience from the residency. How did that kind of factor into those kind of three points that you made about sort of that investment in people, a recognition of creating space, a temporal space, creating time, and also that idea of expertise? Were there certain notes that were struck for you?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that it was important for them to be able to be kind of removed from their daily lives, right? To have these different experiences, even if you're meeting with people who you've heard about or you've had emails with or whatnot. But the kind of in-person experience, I think, cannot be overlooked.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like, that just getting out of your daily routine. Right? And then being inspired by something else, I think is what these kinds of residencies are made for. I was interested in kind of the discussion around cultural appropriation. And, I'm Native Hawaiian. Right now there's an exhibition at the British Museum of Native Hawaiian artifacts, and I was actually really interested in taking a look and seeing how they interpret it and whatnot. And so I think that, again, you could see something online, but it's different when you're actually in the space and experiencing it, and then seeing other people experiencing it.
Obviously, Ed, that was a kind of a very direct kind of sort of, sort of context, that your residency kind of continually kind of had to sort of navigate. Was there?
Yeah, I think in terms of like the Viennese, what's the right word? Context, cultural appropriation is not really a big discussion point for them. So I think when you see signage like that, and there's all of this like Australiana kind of pieces kind of all around Vienna, because apparently everyone ends up in Vienna instead of Australia. So it's a really interesting kind of, for them it's this like playful fun, like kangaroos and koalas type of experience. But for a First Nations person coming to that space, it's like, it's not that funny. But it's that kind of notion of like seeing something online versus seeing something in person is a completely different experience. So while I'm interested in, these record keeping and this like collection online to provide access for mob that do not, will probably never get to the British Museum, it is a completely different experience being there and being with objects and holding them, even though you're wearing latex gloves. It's a completely different experience.
I think that, and with the minute that we have left, that really kind of strikes to the heart of, I think, the point that I just kind of seeded earlier about this idea of reciprocity and the reciprocal dimension of this. Like, we even use the words, what were your takeaways, from the residency? And there is a kind of a colonizing kind of venture in kind of setting off on this kind of expedition, discovering and finding things and bringing them back and taking them away and doing something with them here. But from my experience of kind of being involved, in particular in Vienna, when these guys were there, along with another sort of dozen Swiss, Austrian, German, I think there's even someone from Luxembourg that were kind of part of the cohort. Your contribution to those discussions from your positionality was an incredible giving to that event. I'm wondering how you guys, maybe just to conclude, how you felt your role within that, what you offered back, what did you kind of give to that context? What did you see the other people kind of, what did they get from your contribution?
You go, Jan.
Any thoughts?
Well, I feel like there just was generally a real kind of generosity of knowledge sharing. So that was across the board. So really appreciated that. But I don't know, I think there was lots of people from the glam sector there, archives. And the collections were quite, big. And so for me coming in, small regional gallery, contemporary art space, like that was a different kind of conversation that was being had. But some of those things about, like ethical rights, data sovereignty, I feel like we weren't able to maybe go as far as I wanted to in the Belvedere Summer School. I feel like that was an expectation that I thought I'd get out of it, which wasn't. And so having those conversations, I felt like there was more conversations that I was able to progress in Canada. Maybe there's a similarity with Canada and Australia in that sense. Anyway, you guys.
Any final comments to add? All good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Thank you, everybody. If you could join me in just thanking Malia for kind of joining us from San Francisco. Everybody here as well. Again, we look forward to the conversations continuing. Some of the questions on Slido we will share kind of a little bit more internally and ideally find a mechanism by which to respond. But hopefully we covered a range of bases there in our talk. And I know we have a quick kind of handover and turnaround, so we might sort of hand back to Britt. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.